In the reflective quiet that greets every historic investigation, one cannot help but see patterns recurring not only in the chronicles of long-lost empires, but in the practical reality of our everyday financial lives. My name is Ethan Clark, historian, storyteller, and veteran observer of empires and their grand unravelings in my 6 decades studying the sinews that bind wealth, power, and society. I have witnessed the invisible mechanisms by which riches both bind and break nations. Today, I invite you on an inquiry into the subtle and strategic pressures which, over a single turbulent century, brought the world's largest empire low, and which now cast their shadows over our own United States. Let me say this clearly: to understand the full sweep and true nature of what's happening, to appreciate the social, financial, and conspiratorial threads woven through this story of national decline, you must make sure to watch until the end and then comment where you're tuning in from, city and country, so we can see just how far the reach of history goes. Every perspective matters as we connect the fate of empire with our daily experience. Cast your mind back to the first days of the 20th century. Britain stood atop the world, her fleets ruling the seas, her merchants bearing treasures from every continent. The financial world spun on the axle of London's markets, with gold and credit flowing in patterns as intricate as the embroidery on a royal robe. Yet beneath the ostentatious surface, amid the luxury and certainty, cracks were forming. Observers of the day identified early signs of industrial stagnation. The best practices that once powered the empire's manufactures and coal mines lost momentum, often because the old guard resisted innovation, clinging to traditional spinning mules or hand tools while competitors abroad introduced automatic looms and mechanical cutters. In the coal-rich north of England, for example, many investments went into depth far away, pursuing new profits across oceans instead of into domestic modernization. One recent study notes that by 1913, fully 32% of Britain's wealth was vested overseas, with billions staked in American railroads, Argentinian utilities, and other lucrative foreign adventures. The golden torrent of British capital streamed away from home, draining the energy of local industry and concentrating the fruits of empire in increasingly remote ventures. Yet these flows of capital were a symptom, not a cause, of deeper demographic and social shifts. As waves of energetic young Britons emigrated to America and other New World economies, the age structure of British society changed profoundly. Money remained, but the risk-taking spirit and capacity for domestic renewal grew thin. These older generations, comfortable, vested in the fruits of a long prosperity, invested more in the safety and luxury of overseas projects than in the inventive, risky business of modernizing their homeland. In the streets and parliament halls, meanwhile, rising labor activism and the expansion of social safety nets signaled that the new liberals, including figures like Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, saw clearly the fraying of consensus and the rise of political division. Their policies, sometimes visionary, sometimes desperate, aimed to stave off unrest and placate both the proud aristocrats and restless working poor. But already, the labor movement and the formation of a dedicated labor party began eroding the old aristocratic order from within. Money, as ever, flowed toward volatility. Britain's lifeblood pulsed with borrowing, the reliance on foreign capital growing, a dangerous dependency. When war approached, this network of creditors and debtors, of gold reserves and bills, began to seize. The ominous drama of July 1914 saw financial panic on the London market, foreign exchange evaporating and the venerable London Stock Exchange closing for the first time in its history. Even raising the bank rate sky-high couldn't avert the collapse of liquidity. War forced the government into desperate measures, borrowing massively and printing money at the cost of later inflation. In the private ledgers of men like David Lloyd George, we find fierce arguments about whether wartime loans had to bear high interest, and the bitter conclusion that lending terms left Britain deeper in debt than necessity or prudence demanded. The flames of war burned through more than finances. Two world wars cost not just treasure, but the very foundations of Britain's social and cultural identity. The dazzling luxury of the empire's golden age faded, rationing and austerity replaced opulence, while social unrest simmered in bombed-out cities. Allies and rivals, once trading partners and confidants, turned their economic levers against Britain, pushing her from dominance into desperate negotiation. The pound sterling lost its place as the world's reserve currency, a blow from which Britain would never fully recover. The rhythm of music halls and afternoon teas gave way to deindustrialization as the empire retreated from India, Africa, and the Caribbean, unable to sustain the immense costs of imperial maintenance. Once the colonies had been seen as sources of wealth and splendor, by the post-war era, they had turned into burdens on an exhausted, indebted treasury. This collapse was not simple. At its heart, it reveals how elites, financiers, politicians, the very architects of imperial grandeur, shaped outcomes through subtle, sometimes invisible strategic pressure. Throughout Britain's decline, decision-makers sought to preserve their own fortunes and privileges, hedging against risk by moving capital out of domestic industries and into safer, more profitable foreign ventures. The richness they had accumulated fueled their options, but deprived the nation of the reinvestment needed to compete with ascendant powers like the United States. British leaders, maneuvering through a bewildering landscape of shifting alliances, responded to economic stress by consolidating their own power. Privatizing gains, socializing losses, they steered reforms and enacted policies that sometimes shielded their own interests, sometimes sacrificed them to the necessities of wartime survival. These maneuvers did not always appear conspiratorial, but their cumulative effect was systematic. The empire hollowed out elite interests, sometimes diverging from the broad public good. In these decades, polarization was more than political. It became a deeply embedded social feature. Laissez-faire attitudes, the belief that the market would cure all ills, lost their sheen amid persistent poverty, ill health, and growing calls for government intervention. The Labour Party, newly formed, threatened the established liberal and conservative order, representing voices who questioned the old distribution of money, value, and luxury. Class tensions erupted across the nation, with strikes and marches marking a population no longer content with inherited privilege. Literary figures, journalists, and public intellectuals debated the nature of Britain's decline, some blaming excessive foreign investment, others an unwillingness among elites to reform or innovate. The luxury that had once seemed limitless now appeared precarious, dependent on structures both economic and cultural that were unraveling. Decisive moments, the end of World War I, the Great Depression, the onset of World War II accelerated these internal dynamics. When the Second Global Conflagration ended, the exhausted nation faced not just economic crisis but existential uncertainty. Vast debts to allies like the United States, the collapse of colonial administration, and the rise of new global powers forever changed Britain's fortunes. No longer the uncontested leader of world finance, Britain became a junior partner in an emerging American century. The story, often told as a tale of battles and treaties, is just as much a drama of boardrooms and lending offices, where the fate of luxury, capital, and social structure turned upon decisions both grand and minute. Here, history's parallels with our American present emerge with clarity. As we look across the currents of time, the mechanisms driving Britain's decline, the overextension of wealth, reliance on foreign capital, internal polarization, and elite strategies of capital movement resonate with contemporary patterns in the United States. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have brought the U.S. vast riches, global dominance, and unrivaled influence. Yet, under the surface, we see echoes of Britain's challenges: industrial stagnation, rising debt burdens, relentless polarization in politics, and a growing tendency for capital to seek haven offshore. American fortunes, some worn risk becoming as unmoored from domestic renewal as those of the British Empire at its zenith. Indeed, historian Charles Mayer reminds us that to investigate empire is to ask how a nation's wealth, ambition, and social order intertwine with the violence and volatility of power politics. In the pages of economic ledgers and the columns of social commentators, we read stories that, while novel in detail, rhyme in their broad themes of luxury and collapse. Even now, questions linger. Is American power, like that of Britain, built upon foundations sturdy enough to withstand the shifting tides of global finance and social conflict? Does the richness we see in our cities and markets cloak deeper vulnerabilities waiting for their moment to surface? Consider for a moment the role of external rivals and shifting alliances. Just as Britain found itself pressed by the ambitions of rising powers and the recalibration of alliances in the 20th century, today's United States faces renewed competition from emerging economies. The BRICS nations now command a formidable share of global GDP, and financiers track their currencies, commodities, and infrastructure investments with anxious fascination. Asian markets surge, echoing the way American industry once outstripped British textiles and steel, deploying technological innovation to exploit environments and create new riches. Investors feel the tremor of change, wondering whether volatility in U.S. equities is merely a passing storm or a sign of deeper transformation. Luxury assets, safe havens, and new public works become the objects not just of private desire but of collective strategic necessity. Through the lens of real history, we see deeper patterns emerging. The ways empires sustain themselves, the forms of pressure that erode consensus and fragment unity, and the strategic playbook elites deploy to safeguard their fortunes. In Britain's decline, the interplay of internal division and external competition, the long shadow of spectacular wealth, and the ultimately unsustainable cost of empire revealed that even the greatest systems depend upon trust, adaptability, and shared purpose. As this narrative unfolds, let us remember why the lessons of history matter for our own moment. The decline of the British Empire was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, often invisible reconfiguration of incentives, values, and pressures. Wealth, luxury, money, all these form a tapestry of interdependence between elites and society, the powerful and the vulnerable, the nation and the world. To see the full picture, to understand not only the situation of the past but the shape of our own time, requires an engagement not just with the facts, but with the living drama of history. Every perspective, every city and every country represented among viewers, adds to our understanding of how empires rise, falter, and sometimes renew themselves. So join me as we continue this journey, tracing the invisible lines from Britain's exhausted treasury and fashionable salons to the ferocious debates of our American present. Next, we turn attention to how these old patterns echo among the institutions, values, and fortunes that shape the lives of everyone living in these United States, poised on the threshold of possibility and peril. In the ongoing search for meaning within the storied sequence of American progress, one must wrestle honestly with the present, a nation gilded in tremendous wealth but marked by internal cacophony and unsettling uncertainty. As a historian, I am drawn to these dissonances not as mere curiosities, but as signs. The United States, having long presented itself as an indomitable beacon of ingenuity, freedom, and capital, now finds its vitality challenged in startlingly familiar patterns. The lessons of the British Empire, once whispered in privileged corridors and intellectual salons, have become the open subject of public debate. The abundance that defines American life, gleaming towers, an endless current of digital innovation. Markets laced with opportunity rubs uncomfortably against the raw fact of political discord and economic precarity. These are not new phenomena, yet they seem to deepen as the era advances. Decades of research confirm that polarization in the United States is not an occasional flare, but a steadily growing fire stoked since the late 20th century, when party alignments solidified after the cultural and legislative storms of the 1960s and 70s. Ideological positions hardened on both sides of the aisle. Scholars from Pew, Duke, and the Carnegie Endowment detail how voters now express not just disagreement but a sustained suspicion, and even contempt for their opponents, a trend far more pronounced than in most democracies. The consequences are profound. As polarization surges, common ground erodes and the notion of national identity fractures, driving wedges through families, workplaces, and neighborhoods. American political life, captured in the headlines and heated exchanges of Congress or late-night television, has become a microcosm of fragmentation. Recent Gallup and Freedom House findings connect this dynamic directly to Democratic backsliding, noting that it impedes collective decision-making and reduces support for long-standing democratic norms. While Americans take pride in their robust political culture, the present climate is marked by a furious pace of change and a growing crisis of trust. The digital age accelerated this, with information silos and media echo chambers multiplying at a breakneck rate. What was once a melting pot of ideas has begun to congeal into rival enclaves. The rise of targeted advertising, algorithm-driven polarization, and hyperpartisan news cycles ensures that citizens often experience not a national dialogue but parallel monologues, fervent and rarely intersecting. Under such conditions, even universal values like freedom, democracy, or opportunity are slyly reframed as points of division rather than unity. The luxury of ambitious self-invention which powered American society in the post-war boom is threatened by a sense of drift by the persistent uncertainty over what precisely unites the American people in this century. Economics, as ever, both reflects and amplifies these trends. The late 20th century transformation of the American economy has been both dazzling and destabilizing. One cannot ignore how richness shimmers through all levels of American life: the suburbs of Silicon Valley, the brick townhouses of Boston, the glittering towers on Manhattan's skyline. Yet, underneath these triumphs lies an infrastructural nervousness. Since the 1980s, as the United States pursued a new global economic architecture, a curious pattern emerged. Wealth poured into the markets, yet the industrial heartland quietly eroded. Manufacturing jobs, once the backbone of American prosperity and security, disappeared. As corporations chased lower costs through offshoring and automation at its peak, this offshoring wave contributed to a decline of more than 17 percentage points in domestic manufacturing employment, a transformation that favored capital and technology over the working and middle classes. Technological innovation alone cannot insulate a society from financial turbulence. Instead, it often intensifies the velocity with which money, power, and jobs move. As investment flowed into high-flying sectors, finance, technology, luxury real estate, new vulnerabilities emerged. The fragility of the U.S. financial system became starkly visible during recurring market shocks. Scholars like Bugliano and Marana describe how excessive leverage, cheaply available capital, and spiraling speculation flooded the American economy with money, but rendered it ever more sensitive to the slightest tremors. Each crisis, from the dot-com bust to the mortgage collapse, exposed the limits of unchecked exuberance. Debt accumulation presents another defining hazard. With mounting government deficits, some analysts now caution that the United States approaches a fiscal threshold beyond which even the most dramatic interventions may not forestall rupture. The Penn-Wharton budget model asserts that, left unaddressed, the federal debt will crowd out public investment, fueling inflation, suppressing growth, and eroding the privilege of the dollar as the world's reserve currency within just a few decades. The temptation to print money trading long-term stability for short-term relief has dire implications, both for Americans' purchasing power and for the global trust that has long underwritten U.S. hegemony. It is not unlike the dilemmas Britain faced, the burden of defending a superstructure of privilege while juggling fiscal pressures, volatile alliances, and restive publics. For those joining midway through this exploration, remember, if you value thoughtful historical analysis, like this video, subscribe for more content, tap the notification bell to stay updated, and let us know where you're watching from, city and country, in the comments. Each viewer's perspective enriches our shared understanding of history and its living echoes. As American industry shifted, so did the behaviors of elites. The story, oft repeated but rarely grasped fully, is this: under strategic pressure, regulatory scrutiny, global competition, or domestic strife, those with means act to protect their assets. Recent research demonstrates that elites respond to shifts in American policy by offshoring capital, sheltering wealth in distant financial centers, and leveraging power to shape legal environments in their favor. Corporate and financial titans, perceiving threats at home, deploy resources in ways that shield their fortunes, often placing these riches beyond the reach of ordinary regulation. In this, they echo the grand strategies of their British forebears. The pursuit of luxury and security takes precedence over investments that might truly renew the national fabric. In the era of American extraterritorial power and economic sanctions, vast fortunes vanish into the circuits of the world's shadow financial systems, leaving policymakers and ordinary citizens to grapple with the social consequences. But the pressure does not come only from within. The emergence and consolidation of the BRICS bloc in alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa signals an unmistakable redistribution of global power. For much of the post-war 20th century, the United States made strategic decisions with little regard for rival centers of influence. Now, in documented studies tracing global economic power, it is clear that the unipolar moment has passed. As Washington contends with credible challenges from Beijing, new alliances in the global south, and heightened competition for markets and resources, American economic preeminence cannot be taken as a given. Internationally, these pressures are accompanied by deepening skepticism about the structures that once anchored American leadership. Threats of sanctions, economic coercion, and regulatory action now drive not just rivals but domestic elites to re-examine their strategies. The U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, designed to combat corporate wrongdoing abroad, has, according to published analyses, prompted waves of legal incorporations and capital transfers to new offshore centers as those with wealth seek to circumvent perceived constraints. American influence is immense, yet never absolute, and the more tightly it is wielded, the more incentives arise for creative circumvention. This feedback loop between elite strategy and institutional fragility is matched by wider social effects. The social contractor is bound by mutual expectations of advancement fractures into a contest of grievances. Working-class and middle-class Americans, increasingly aware that luxury and upward mobility belong to fewer and fewer, are left to struggle with the practical fallout. Rising insecurity, declining consensus around national identity, and periodic eruptions of protest all attest to the simmering unease. Data from Gallup show how Americans now cluster ever more tightly along ideological and demographic lines. Their experience is shaped as much by the information they consume as the realities they endure. If the historian's task is to trace causes as well as consequences, it becomes necessary to highlight the recurring interplay of opportunity and crisis. Each effort to centralize power, to accumulate greater wealth, or to exert international dominance generates countervailing pressures. In recent years, market meltdown-like events from the 2008 crash to sharp convulsions in cryptocurrency and banking reflect both the power and the fragility of contemporary finance. Easy money and aggressive leverage create the appearance of unbreakable prosperity, yet tiny shocks are enough to upend confidence. This phenomenon is as present in boardroom deliberations as in policy debates. Fundamental shocks to the system, left unaddressed, resonate across generations. In pursuit of renewal, American society must reckon with the open-ended question of how to proceed. Some respond with new calls for unity across different summoning the spiritual and cultural resources that have so often defined moments of national recovery. Others look to innovation, not only technological, but also social and institutional, to bridge the divides that threaten the country's coherence. There is ample precedent for both. History records moments when the nation reaffirmed its collective purpose, finding synthesis in the face of difference. At other times, however, the polarization in pursuit of private advantage proved too difficult to overcome, driving periods of stagnation or decline. What will decide our fate now is not simply the magnitude of riches amassed, nor the cunning of elites in navigating markets and governments, but the depth of shared commitment to durable values. Money, luxury, and power derive much of their meaning from the broader community that sustains them. The history of empires, ancient and modern, suggests that when trust, adaptability, and mutual responsibility are neglected in favor of short-term advantage, the conditions are ripe for decay. To return to the thread that has woven the American and British narratives together, one observes how social fragmentation is both a symptom and a cause of shifting power. The risks facing the United States' economic volatility, institutional frailty, relentless competition are neither novel nor inevitable. Rather, they are the product of long-term dynamics and conscious decisions. The ultimate lesson, emerging across centuries and supported by historical research, is that the story of empire is never closed. The echoes of past patterns warn and instruct, inviting this generation to reflect deeply and act purposefully. As each ripple of change travels from boardrooms to households, from digital debates to policy chambers, the stakes remain immense. Let this serve as a testament. History's verdict is not merely imposed but shaped by the ongoing choices of citizens, institutions, and leaders. In the lived tension between unity and division, between richness and insecurity, between soaring ambition and prudent stewardship, the path of the United States will be determined. In the closing light of this present era, as fortunes are made and lost against the backdrop of a changing world order, one can only urge attentiveness and unwavering commitment to learning from the past while recognizing the profound agency we still possess.